overall interest in development economics and behavioral economics, and right now specifically in the area of health. Yeah, so that's mostly about me, and I think we can talk through as we progress.
Awesome. Yeah, similarly, I think they've already mentioned kind of our previous work experiences and previous education. I think one way that I didn't apply to any economics programs. I applied to public policy programs. And in addition to that, I also applied to a couple of education specific programs, which were usually like education and economics or education and policy and things like that. So I don't think that may be what we're kind of focusing on today, but if that's something that, if we have time for like questions, if someone has any questions of that, we can talk about that as well. Or like if someone wants to drop me a message later, that's fine. But in terms of the programs that I applied to, apart from the education programs, I've only applied to public policy as well as three of those like public policy and economics joint programs. I also exclusively applied only to the US in this cycle. I got one acceptance, and I have taken that offer. So yeah, that is kind of where my focus was. It was very US centric and all policy related programs. So yeah, I'm happy to help in whatever way I can. The kind of programs that I was focusing on were those which had, like an angle with development research, as well as specific to education, labor, gender, kind of those kind of themes in developing countries. So yeah, that's just a little bit about the kind of programs that I was targeting. And I think we can go over to Anahita now.
Great, thank you so much. To start off, I think thanks so much everybody for joining. I also do want to contextualize by saying that all three of us are applicants from India. And so I think we're positioned to answer questions about applying to PhD programs from India. A lot of things will be the same. Some things might be different, such as GRE and TOEFL and other stuff, but we'll get to that. But I think if you have any further questions that we're not able to answer today, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll try our best to connect you to other people who might be able to help you better. And like Ayushi said, I wouldn't call it wisdom, but happy to kind of just pay this forward, because I know I received a ton of help during this application process, and it's a grueling, long process. And so in any way, if I can help, more than happy to. A little bit about me, I think. So Ayushi already covered my background, but just in some ways that it's different from Prachi and Vasanthi's is that I've almost exclusively just studied in India. So my undergraduate and master's degrees from India. I don't have a degree from outside of India. And then followed by that, I have work experience at JPAL South Asia, as Ayushi mentioned. My current research interests, I call it current because these things change, are in development, labor, and gender economics. And when I was applying, I was basically focused on economics programs because I knew I wanted a little bit of flexibility in terms of what I could study and have some room to kind of change my interests from development into something maybe a little bit more technical. I applied to both the US and Europe, but Europe basically, well, this lesser kind of chunk of my applications, a major chunk was the US. And then I applied to Canada, which is where I will end up going. And I also did apply widely. So I applied to 25 programs. I know this is usually like a way larger number than most people would apply. And it also comes with kind of being able to fund that kind of application cycle. But essentially, I applied widely, keeping a couple of things in mind, which we'll get to later. But that's just kind of putting my background in context. We can move into just kind of kickstarting the talk.
Awesome. Yeah, so I thought we had thought that we can start kind of just with thinking about why you would want to do a PhD. And I think this would be relevant maybe if there are some people here who haven't yet completely decided that they're still on the fence about applying, or, do I want to actually put in the effort and bring this entire process? So I think we could like just start with some of the basic kind of, why do a PhD related points. And then the three of us can also share why we decided to, do a PhD, maybe why you chose this cycle or the previous cycle. Like, how do you decide that, okay, this is when I think I'm ready to take the plunge and start doing applications? So I think the most important points that, the three of us were discussing were things like, you have an interest in doing your own research output. You have an interest in, maybe being in academia, and maybe trying to apply to academic jobs where a PhD may be a prerequisite. you actually enjoy the process of the research, not just the research output, but the entire process which goes into it. It's obviously a very long degree to commit to, but the kind of like the stuff that goes into it is stuff that you genuinely do enjoy. Perhaps if you are interested in specific policy or development or maybe behavioral related questions which you want to lead your own research on, those were kind of the things that we thought about, that these may be things that we are interested in. When thinking about why and when I want to do a PhD, I think initially I was just kind of very hesitant about putting in applications because I wasn't fully sure if this is what I wanted to commit to at the time, but also, oh, am I good enough to do the applications this year? Those kind of general doubts which have happened, I think, to everyone. So for me, I knew I wanted to work in research for quite some time. I think having the experience of working at places like JPAL, where you are very much in the academic research space, has been really helpful, where you're usually working directly with professors and things like that. It's been a great experience of, kind of knowing what goes into that world and that kind of work, which I really enjoyed. And for me, honestly, I kind of just decided to just give it a shot this year. There was no like, oh, I'm ready this year or not ready this year. I think the previous year, I was a little hesitant, with COVID and things like that, about putting in applications. And so this year just kind of went for it. I had a couple of years of work experience already. And I think this differs person to person, but I felt like I had enough experience to give it a shot this year. So yeah, that was just kind of my reasoning. We can have Vasanthi and Anahita also share a little bit.
I'm just going to go on, Anahita. I'm going to be as honest as possible through this, because I think, like Prachi mentioned, we've all been hesitant through this process when we started, through the process, etc. So immediately after my master's, if you asked me if I were to do a PhD, I would have said no, because I hadn't thought about doing a PhD. I think for me, the major factor that did influence is working with, IFMR lead and JPAL in the behavioral development lab, like Prachi said, closely with research, right? Because you're looking through the process, see, you get an understanding of what excites you, etc. And I realized that research does excite me. And what excites me more is creating a particular idea, designing it, and those were my highs. So I realized that if I had to progress in this line of career, I think PhD becomes a good signal, but also gives you like a focused area or a period to hone your skills, as well as understand, your core interest areas. Because when you're working in organizations, you're also exploring a lot of topics and a lot of things. And for me, a PhD was this stipulated period or a focused period that helps me connect as to what I like, what I don't like. And like Anahita mentioned at some point, it's always evolving. So I think to get that focus as well as to develop skills was my idea. And I also knew that I wasn't going into academia when I started. So I focused on programs that would help me come back into the development sector with my own projects, with my own research. So I mostly focused on European programs, because European programs mostly take that shape and form. Another criteria that I did have when I wanted to do a PhD is I was fairly certain that I was going to work in developing sector, and developing countries. So I looked at projects and research work that were going on in countries like India, because A, I have context, B, I'm really interested in working in certain questions there. So for me, it was more to do with, in the long term, how would I like my career to take shape, and how important the PhD was for it to take shape. And that's how I think my decision-making process worked. And like Prachi mentioned, we've all been hesitant when we start applying. Am I good enough? Is it a good place to start? Should I work a few more years? All of that has happened. But I think at some point we realized that, I personally realized that it was time that I started, because I thought that I had enough work experience and experience in the field as well to explore this. So yeah, I think that's about my journey of decision-making and why I want to do a PhD. And Anahita, maybe you should.
Yeah, I think there are just like two quick things I'll add. Largely, I think my decision-making process aligns with Prachi and Vasanthi, so I won't repeat that. But I think one major, in terms of advice that I received, because I went back and forth between, deciding whether or not I want to do a PhD. I thought about it for a really long time. One really useful advice I received was kind of what's on the slide, which says that, you really have to have a high consumption value from the PhD process itself. It takes 5 to 6 years of your life, basically, when you're pretty much at your prime in a lot of cases. So, you're spending a good chunk of your 20s, a good chunk of your early 30s doing this. And so you really have to, if you derive enjoyment and pleasure out of those 6 years, then it's worth the plunge. as opposed to kind of, it's not one of those degrees where you say, okay, I'm going to go in for 1.5, 2 years, acquire some useful skills and leave and move on to doing something that I actually enjoy. And it's only meant for skill building. On the other hand, it's kind of a degree or a process where you really have to derive high consumption value from those 5 to 6 years. And I think putting it in that context really helped me think about it. Am I going to be happy for these 5 to 6 years doing what full-time researchers do, which is thinking about your own research questions and trying to answer them creatively. The next kind of thing that I'll add is in terms of why to do a PhD. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it's a decision that you have to take basically about 6 to 8 months before you actually decide to apply, because the application cycle is really long and it involves multiple components that take time to put together. And so essentially, if you're contemplating applying at the end of this year, say, most deadlines are in December and January. And so if you're deciding to apply at the end of this year, you should by July, I would say have a decision about whether or not you want to apply. I think if you decide only by October, September, or even November, it's a lot more stress. And of course, if you'd want to put yourself through that, that's totally fine. But I would also recommend kind of thinking through it and giving yourself enough time to apply. The application cycle itself is kind of a 6 to 8 month long process. And so just factor that in when you're thinking of this decision. And lastly, I think, like Vasanthi said, I've been working very closely with researchers for the last 3 years. I think in terms of skill building, I also noticed a bit of a plateau in terms of, the work that I was doing. I was deriving a lot of joy from it, but was I learning something new every day? Probably not. And so I think if you find yourself reaching that plateau, that's probably where you want to start thinking about, okay, like, is there something I want to do after this to kind of further build my career or further kind of develop more skills than what I already have? And that's kind of the stage where you start thinking about what to do next.
Yeah, awesome. Just gonna go to the next slide. So yeah, we have a bit of stuff on how do you start choosing which programs to apply to. So I can start this, and Vasanthi and Anahita at any time just hop in. So there's no like right or wrong way necessarily to go about this, because there's a lot of things which go into consideration for this, and it's possible that you find some programs which hit all the marks very well. There are some where you may get some things are in line with what you're looking for, some are not, and it also just kind of comes down to sort of prioritizing what matters more to you, or what is really important towards that particular program or that kind of course structure and things like that. So I think some of the most important things, and I think probably the most important things, is when you're looking to apply, you really need to look at a good fit with your department and your professors. And what we mean by good fit is usually like having people who are interested in the same kind of themes or the same kind of methods or same kind of geographies that you're interested in. So for example, if you find a program which is great in every other aspect, but maybe you are very keen to do only India related work, and maybe they have not a single researcher doing anything in India, you want to kind of think about whether that department will be able to support you in your research, or conversely, whether they think you'd be a good addition to their team. And this is also, we'll come to this a little bit later, but that's also where choosing a PhD is very different from choosing a master's, because you're not just looking for someone to take you as a student, you're kind of also taking someone who's basically hiring you for a really long time. So you kind of have to think of it both ways, whether that's a good fit, whether that's someone who you are interested in working with, people who, they don't have to be working on all the same things that you are interested in, but somewhat, whose portfolio is of interest to you, someone who you can, people you can see yourself sort of working with. That's a really important part of applying, and that's often a very important part of screening processes when they're looking at applications. Some of the other things to think about are things like duration. So like Anahita mentioned, a lot of your US programs, especially your PhD econ and stuff, it's very common for them to go on to like 6 years, sometimes even 7 years. Whereas a lot of programs in places like the EU are often as short as 3 years. You have some programs in like the UK and stuff, which are like 4 years. And so you need to also think a little bit about how much time you're willing to, basically stop any other career plans or, things like that, and, go into this full-time program. It's just an important part of it. And usually that kind of comes along with coursework requirements, which differ place to place. They're not necessarily tied 100%, but they are quite strongly correlated. So that's a point we talk about lower down, but I can just address that right now. So for example, the US programs often have a very strict requirement that your first 2 years are coursework, and then you kind of transition into being a full-time researcher. Whereas, like Vasanthi can talk about this later as well, but for example, she kind of hit the ground running with research when she joined her program, and she does have some coursework requirements, but she's is a full-time researcher. She's not a PhD student, so to speak, in terms of having to do like a whole, like basically another master's program, like probably what me and Anahita will be doing when we enter our programs. So again, that can be something which you think about, whether that's something that is interesting to you. It was for me. I am looking forward to doing coursework. I don't have a master's in economics, so I am particularly looking forward to having like that year of foundational coursework before going in further. But for someone maybe who already has an advanced master's, that may not really be of interest, so that's relevant. You also want to think about where this PhD takes you. I think a lot of times when we're looking at applying to PhD programs, your application and getting in becomes the end goal, but it's not. That's just the start of a very long process. And you want to think about what happens after your PhD program. So you want to think about where this program has been successful in placing students, like do all their students end up exiting and going into industry, whereas you are very keen on maybe working as a professor. Maybe all of their people end up working, having great academic placements, but you're someone who maybe wants to come back to India or go back to your home country and work in industry. So things like that I don't know if they are, things 6 years later can be very, very different, but maybe that's something to keep at the back of your mind, just thinking about these kind of things. And then of course you have, some entry requirements, which we were discussing this as well, the three of us, like how do you think about entry requirements? Is it like do you take it as a hard and fast rule, like, oh, they need a 3.5 GPA minimum, I have a 3.4, should I apply, should I not apply? And the only way to kind of address that is by maybe talking to people in the department and kind of trying to figure out, is that like a suggestion? Like, yeah, we seem to have lots of students who come in maybe with 3.3 GPA and above, or is it like a necessary screening tool, and kind of taking a call with that? Because you want to think about if there's like a definite screening rule. Like, for example, I know there's some programs which earlier did not look at applicants who had a quant GRE score of like under 167. And so logically for someone like me who got a 165, I maybe should not have bothered applying there. But from what I understand now, a lot of those rules aren't so hard and fast. And it's like, it's okay, yeah, like a higher score is good, but it's not like, it doesn't matter if you don't hit that score. So you want to think about things like that as well, whether you want to go for it or do you want to just maybe skip that university and look at some other place. You want to think about funding for sure. This is going to, for many people, be a primary source of income for the next 5 years. So you want to think about things like whether you have, full funding to cover your entire tuition requirement. Do you have a livable stipend in the city that you're in? Do you have, things like insurance, things like that covered? Will those be deducted from the stipend? Are they like lots of things like that? Just kind of trying to figure out, how are you going to live during the program? And there may be some other constraints as well, which we can touch upon briefly because these will be really individual based. But you do want to think about things like the location of the program, maybe. So, for example, if you're going to be spending 6 years in a place like Michigan or Massachusetts, which gets really cold in the winter, is that something that you're okay to do? Because it's not really like a master's program where you just need to power through like 1 or 2 winters. But are you okay to do that for like 6 years? Or if you have family commitments or you have a partner who's going to move with you, are you okay to be in like a university town where they may not have opportunities to work in any other like big companies nearby, and you're going to be looking at like a long commute for them up and down from some other city or things like that? So those may be things that you kind of need to consider as well when you're applying for programs. And if there are some things like this which become a hard no for you, you may want to consider like, should I even bother putting in applications for such programs, or putting in applications for programs you would actually be happy to attend? There will be those which you are more excited about, but if there are places which are like a complete no, like, oh, even if I got an admit, I would not go here, you maybe want to consider if you want to put an application in altogether. And this is perhaps more topical, but things like in places like the US, maybe like state to state, your politics and things like that differ very widely. Depending on that, if there may be some kind of things that you want to take a call on. If you want to be in a state where maybe, certain healthcare is more accessible than others, there may be, cases of certain kind of violence which you may not want to be around and things like that. And that differs, state to state, country to country, and it could be something which is very in the forefront of your choice. It may be something which is less relevant for any reason. It's something that you are willing to overlook if like the program is very good. But those things should be things that you kind of have at the back of your mind when you're thinking through these things, because again, this is a big chunk of time that you're looking at there. And I think lastly, also like this also depends on the program as well as the country. You may want to think about your visa status at the end of the program. So for example, like I know like Canada and a lot of the EU programs are they're quite supportive of like being able to get you like work sponsorship and stuff after the program. In the US, it continues to be a little bit varied because it depends program to program. If they have like STEM classification, then like you're able to get a longer work permit and things like that. So that may be stuff that you want to think about a little bit at the time of application if you're keen to work there for a little bit after your program. Vasanthi and Anahita, is there anything else you all want to add?
One other quick point about qualifying exams. And again, these are things that change, but I, for example, like I have massive testing anxiety, which means I don't do well under very high pressure time test formats. And so I knew there were certain schools that had like a one-shot qualifying criteria where you take a qualifying exam at the end of your first year or at some point in the summer, and whether or not you're going to stay in the program depends on that outcome. I know a lot of schools, like the way you're evaluated during these exams is different. And so it's not like it's actually a make or break. Your performance in the coursework is considered and so on. But I, for example, wanted to actively opt out of just putting myself under that kind of pressure where, like this one exam determines my status in the program. Also, there are certain programs that thrive on slightly more competitive versus collaborative atmospheres. And these are things you find out typically by talking to existing PhD students at the program. These are not usually things that are on the website and so on, but kind of just trying to find out whether, your funding is conditional in any format. So if you get in, is funding only going to be given to the top, like, I don't know, 50% of the cohort and everybody else has to figure out funding on their own? Or, is there a culture of certain people dropping out after a qualifying exam, or are there these hard cutoffs in the program that are difficult to meet? And just generally, are the students there happy? Are they finding it good? And I mean, it depends. Again, this is a very personal choice. Some people thrive under competition. Other people thrive under a more collaborative teamwork kind of approach, depending on what you like and what you prefer. Looking into that a little bit and trying to see what the program believes in. I think that's one other useful criteria to consider. And I think I don't know if Vasanthi wants to add anything, but like Prachi said, I want to reiterate that the priority list varies from person to person, right? So these are just some things that went into our decision making. What is top priority for you? What is not top priority for you depends from person to person, and it's very, very individual, I think.
Yeah, just one more thing that I think which is probably very specific to European programs is also the third point on placement of students. Sometimes when you're working on individual supervisors, individual research groups or labs for your PhD programs, these aren't very clear. And one advice that I think was very helpful from one of my PIs was to understand what kind of networks your professors have. Do they have networks in say development organizations or in universities or places that you want to transfer to work in, or people you want to work in? And this is something that can come up in your interviews or conversations. And this is something, like Anahita said, is not up on the website. So this takes a little bit of, I think, research. I think that is one thing that's specific. The other thing is also with respect to when you're looking at which program, also the ability to navigate through the areas of work that you want to do. For example, does doing a public policy PhD help you if you want to transfer to econ at some point? Unfortunately, there are hierarchies and there are barriers, and that's not something all of us are proud of, but they exist. But knowing them and being aware of what options you have in the future is a good thing to consider when you're looking at your PhD programs that you're choosing. Besides that, the last thing that practically I think the process of applying to a PhD itself is research. So it's extensive amount of recording every piece of information you have in whichever order of priority that fits you the best, but also recording that extensively is very helpful. Excel sheets or whatever works for you. I think that helps you track through which programs I want to, what meets my choices and options, etc. So I think that's something that helped me. So yeah, I think that's mostly I have about this question.
Awesome. I think now we'll be going into, like Anahita mentioned at the start, the the number of items which go into your application package. There's quite a bit of components, and so we'll be trying to go over the stuff which I think almost all of them were like required for all of us. There's some things which may not be required at every university, but these are kind of like the most important things you should be ready to tackle in the next few months if you're planning to apply this year. Um, so I think we'll start with the program list. Anahita, will you be taking over here?
Sounds good. So kind of continuing with what we were just talking about, once you have some sense for, what your preferences are with respect to program type. So, whether you want to apply for econ programs, applied econ programs, public policy programs, education policy programs, health policy programs, agriculture, resource economics programs, depending on what you identify as your pool. And once you have kind of a little bit of clarity about your preferences related to the duration of the program and the location and so on, in terms of like continent, so not like which state you want to live in, but more like, okay, I only want to focus on Europe for ABC reasons, or I want to focus on the US for whatever reasons. Once you have a little bit, so I think step one is trying to sort out at least broadly those preferences. And then as early as you can, just start going through program websites carefully. And one way I did it is to pull up like a couple of these ranking lists. So if you just Google like econ PhD rankings, and I would say like don't take the ranking super seriously. Rather, what that gives you in some sense is just like a exhaustive list of programs, or like at least universities that are out there, which typically is not easy to come by or even know. And then once you start going university by university, you'll discover what programs they have. And one suggestion here is that a lot of schools have public policy departments that are different from economics departments, that are different from business departments, that are also sometimes different from like agricultural or applied economics departments. So if you're looking at a particular university, and education policy and health policy are sometimes different as well. So when you're going university by university, what you want to do is, depending on what your interests are and what programs you're interested in applying to, you want to check out these various departments, and you want to start kind of making a list of programs that are available to you that you would consider applying to. And this is a long list, so don't try and shortlist at this stage. Just try and gather as much information about what programs are out there across what you're interested in. As you can see, start creating some kind of a tracker where you start jotting down relevant program information depending on what are priorities for you. Copy in stuff from the website that you think is useful to know about the program, and that's important to you. I think this saves tremendous time going back and forth later, so you're not constantly like looking up programs again when you're actually in the process of applying, because you have all this information on a sheet somewhere. And so try and like start logging this information as early on as you can. And then once you have kind of a longish list of programs that you're broadly interested in, shortlist. And I think the shortlist will come down to what your interests are and which programs really fit your interests, and two, honestly, what your bandwidth is in terms of finances and how many, because every program comes with an application fee, and it's typically, I guess Vasanthi can talk about European programs, sometimes they're free, but for US programs, it's typically $80 to $100. And so, every additional program is an expense. So kind of think about what your upper limit is and create a short list from these list of programs that you said. Just mark yes, no, which you're applying to. And lastly, one thing that's helpful, and if possible for you, run this list by people who are writing your letters, or basically anybody who's in that mentor position for you. What that helps is they sometimes flag programs that you may have missed, because these are academics who are in the space and they're aware of maybe some slightly niche programs that you may not have encountered. They'll tell you like, oh, wait, why don't you check out this program? They have really cool faculty or something like that. And you can go back and look at these programs. And secondly, once you're upfront to your letter writers about your background and your transcripts and so on, they can give you a realistic sense for, where your application stands and which programs seem kind of too ambitious and it's probably better to drop, which programs seem realistic and reasonable and, they think broadly align with your application as well as your interests, and which programs are, again, maybe not such a great fit for you to apply to. Another last thing that I think this really helps is, in this process, you also identify what are the gaps in your application that your letters of recommendation can kind of fill up for you. So for example, if you have a master's degree from India, sometimes your scores don't appear as high because the evaluation system is slightly different. It differs from country to country. And so your letter writers might tell you, okay, like looking at your transcript, I know you're a good student, but these scores might, in the applicant pool that you're going to be up against, these scores might appear a bit low. So can you ask one of your other letter writers to contextualize, like, oh, this person was in this percentile of the class, or, this is what this grade translates to in terms of ability, and so on and so forth. So you identify these gaps that then your letter writers can try and fill when they write these letters for you. But yeah, I think that's it on creating a program list. But I do think that's kind of the first step where you just start to really identify how many programs am I going to apply to, what are these programs going to be. Unless Prachi or Vasanthi have anything to add, we can move on.
I have one really small little point. So Anahita touched upon something which is really important, which is that the universities have these different departments where it's possible that there may be 2 or even 3 departments whose programs are of interest to you. And I think this is something that differs university to university, where sometimes you can apply to multiple programs and sometimes you can't. So for example, when I was applying to NYU, I could apply to the public policy, the public administration program, which is at the Wagner School, but also to one international education program, which is at the Steinhardt School. However, I think there are some universities where you need to choose like one program, and they have a thing like, okay, like, do you want to be referred to another program in case like you are unsuccessful, but we think you're a strong candidate or something like that. But that's not always the case. So I think that's also something which is worth exploring, that if there is an option to apply to multiple programs and they are all interesting to you, then that's great. But there's sometimes maybe a situation where you need to prioritize, okay, out of these 2 programs or 3 programs, I can only apply to one, and which one should that be? And that's something you should spend some time on, because in my case, there was one or 2 schools where the choice came to between like education and policy, and I realized quite close to the deadline. And so those should be things that you kind of think about a little bit earlier and not 2 weeks before the deadline.
Sounds good. I guess before we move on, there are a couple of questions in the chat box that I think it might be useful to take at this point because they align with some of the things we've been covering so far. So I guess one question from Ola Brown is, did any of you consider distance learning programs? I did not, so I don't think I'm in a good position to talk about it, but Prachi or Vasanthi, do you want to?
Yeah, I didn't either. But we can probably, this is something we could get back on because I do not want to talk from a place because I do not have experience considering. So
we can try and find somebody who has, but yeah. So, okay, next, I think, so Kavita Shrikant's question is about interviews. I think we will touch upon interviews soon. So we'll skip that question for now. And Kavita, if you feel like there are any things that we've left uncovered, just kind of put it in the chat box again, and we'll try and take that question a bit later. All right, next from Mahi, suppose you want to work in an institution like IMF or World Bank, or even in government institutions like RBI. Yeah, would a PhD help in getting appointed at these places? Do one of you want to start with that? Or I guess because this lines up with why to do PhD. Yeah.
So yeah, like for example, in my case, the PI that I was working for at JPAL and then the World Bank, she is a PhD holder. And a lot of her colleagues and the people that we kind of worked with were also at different institutions, different international institutions, and sometimes even local institutions in different, at, like a state level in different countries or at the national level. So it kind of differs. So for example, I am aware that there are some research economists at the World Bank Delhi office who don't have a PhD, but there are lots who do. So I think it just depends a bit on maybe that hiring cycle. It's not necessarily just about the role. It could be the kind of people that they've got last year. I do know even like ADB, like the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank and stuff, they have those young professional hiring as well. And they having a PhD basically waives you off like a few years of work requirement at the time of applications and things like that. So I would say for a lot of these jobs, I don't think a PhD is a prerequisite. It may be a good to have. And if there are more research focused roles, like at the World Bank, I know my PI was doing a good chunk of her time was spent on her own research portfolio, in which case her being, PhD holder was good. And I think she went through the job market process as well at the end of her PhD. So yeah, all this to say that it may help for some roles. It may not be a prerequisite for others. So it would really depend on the exact kind of institutions that you're targeting and the kind of role in that you're targeting.
I agree. I completely agree with Prachi. Just one additional point, I think, on her point on how some of these research scientists or roles that probably sometimes don't require. I also think one of them mentioning that sometimes the trade-off of how many years of work experience you have to reach that role without a PhD versus with a PhD. So that's also a trade-off. So if you think you have that amount of experience in the field and you think you're eligible for that role, then you probably do not need a PhD. So I think that's also a trade-off that comes into place in this scenario. But I agree that there definitely are positions for PhD students at these organizations. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much to add. I think they've covered everything. Next question from Renuka is, I've heard that in the UK, you have to scout out your advisor first and they recommend you to the university. How does it differ across different countries and what would be the pros and cons of these programs?
Sorry, do either of you want to hop in? So initially, I actually had considered applying to the UK. I had done my master's at LSE and I was thinking about applying it within the same department. It's the International Development Department, not the Econ department, because um, in many practical purposes, like a lot of the UK econ departments, and so like often your very close departments in like LSE's case, which is the social policy department, they function very similarly to the USA Canada system of you first come in, do your 2 years of coursework where you have kind of like a temporary advisor, but then you go into your research and you're more formally allocated to like having an advisor and like more people on your panel. But what Renuka mentioned here is how a lot of the other departments work. So LSE's like government department as well as ID department, that is how they work, that you had to lock in your advisor before you put in your application. Your application then in many ways was kind of like how the advisor would then campaign for you to be accepted, and then would also be what is used for you securing funding. But in many ways, like you already have someone who's like, yes, this is the candidate that I want. And then it's kind of how successful were they at pushing for your candidature, and then were they able to get you funding. um, that's how at least LSE worked. And I at the time also reached out to a couple of professors at like UCL and King's, and that was sort of the general consensus about how that structure went about at that time. So I would say in terms of pros and cons, I think the pro obviously is that you already have someone who's interested, and it's possible that if you're unsuccessful in this cycle, if they're maybe constrained with funding, or maybe just that professor already maybe had a grad student in the previous year and can't take someone this year, it's very possible that you can say, okay, if I don't get an admit from somewhere else that I'm happy with, can I reapply the following year? And if they're happy to support your candidature again, that is a big pro. The con is that yes, you basically, I mean, in the next 1 or 2 months, you should be like kind of having someone locked in terms of what they want to work on. And what that implies is that you need to have a fully thought out research proposal, which you often need to like defend and be questioned on in your interview. You need to think about how viable that is, how you would fund that research. Like if you are someone who wants to do like an experiment or an RCT or whatever, if it's like a very expensive process, you can't be like, oh, I want to do this and it's a great idea. It's a bit like, okay, so if you enter the program in September, by the next April, how are you going to start this experiment? How are you going to fund it? What is going to happen? What do the next 4 years look like? So that's, I don't know if that's necessarily a con, but I think at where I was at the stage of when I had to put in applications, I don't think I was quite there yet. So yeah, I think Vasanthi, since you also studied in the UK, I don't know if there was any applications that you did or more thought process about it.
Yeah, I think pros, yes. I think you have a set supervisor. There's more stability in what you're doing. So I think it's comforting. The only other con that I can think of is if, let's say, I was just out of my master's when I don't have a clear idea of what sector I'm going to work in within economics or development, it's not a great place because your navigability then is again a problem, right? You're set in most supervisors or more people you're looking at are working at an umbrella of things, but also that are fairly specific. So if you don't think you are absolutely clear on the sector you're choosing, then probably it's not a great place because you want that freedom of movement when you join a PhD. But on the other hand, if you're fairly certain that gender economics is what I want to work on, I'm 100% sure about that, then it's a great position to be in and work because you know somebody who's an expert in it. So I think that's the only contra or decision that you have to think about.
Great. Again, I don't have much to add. Last question we'll take right now from Vishakha, and then we'll move on because I feel like some of the other questions we'll cover as we go along because they're about various elements of the application process. So Vishakha's question is, for me, how can one find out the condition that you mentioned about qualifying exams? I have the same issue of anxiety with a one-shot exam at the end. All right. So Vishakha, I learned this later. So when I was talking to people at programs that had been accepted, that's when I found out that, certain programs have very hard requirements. I feel like most programs mention on their website whether or not you have to appear for a qualifying exam at the end of the first year. Most US programs will tell you straight up that, at the end of the first year or in the summer, you have to sit for a qualifying exam. What is lesser known is how high stakes that is and how much that controls, your progress in the program. That I think comes from talking to PhD students there. And typically talking to one or two people will tell you at least a little bit about what the stakes are. I would also suggest, if you have the bandwidth to apply, I would say maybe you want to apply this filter at a slightly later stage in the application process. So if it comes down to like, okay, I only want to apply to 10 programs and I'm actually interested in 15, how do I sort out those last 5? I think that's probably a place where you want to apply this filter. But because also, there are pros to talking to PhD students at programs, which is that they give you these nuances that you don't otherwise know. But also one slight con is that people are coming from very individual positions. And so what works for some people might not work for you. What works for you might not work for the other person. And so in terms of when you're talking to people about their experiences, it's good to remember that this is one perspective and one kind of individual's experience. And so I've basically just found out from reaching out to PhD students at the program and talking to them about it. And I think one good thing is that people are very forthcoming when it comes to talking about their programs and very helpful in my experience. So that's the short answer. The long answer is a little bit to also just kind of contextualize it a bit and kind of think a bit about at what stage you want to apply this filter and how you want to go about it. Should we keep going then? And then a couple of questions about like research proposals and the relative ranking we'll, I think, touch upon as we go.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so the next part is the letters of recommendation. So I can take this on, and again, Vasanthi and Anahita, please hop on. So yeah, I think Anahita had briefly mentioned this earlier as well, that your LORs are really crucial and they often are a great way to kind of fill the gaps or kind of explain anything which you may think is like a weak part of your application. They're a great way to have someone else talk about skills, or like maybe you have a bad grade and you can have a professor kind of be like, oh, but so-and-so was great otherwise, great work, this blah, 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 things like that. So your LORs are definitely a very important part. I would say, especially at the PhD level, your LORs are a very important part of your application package. You typically need, I think my general experience has been, you need 3 letters for each school. I don't know, I think some of the UK programs, I remember sometimes require 2, but generally the norm is 3 for North America. And one thing to keep in mind is that your application is not considered if you don't have all 3. I think there are like very few circumstances where you can maybe request them to consider it without, but in most cases you need to have all 3 letters in before you can be considered. And what that means is often you not only need to have all 3 of your letter writers locked in, but if possible, if you kind of have like a backup, like maybe a PI or a manager who you've worked with, or like a professor who can talk about your abilities a little bit, just having that 3rd letter so that your application goes through is important. And with that in mind, I think because it's so important, I would say it is really crucial that you talk to your letter writers a few months before deadlines. And at that time, even before portals open to start your application process, just be like, hello, I'm planning to apply for graduate school this year. These are the programs that I'm targeting. Would you be able to write me a letter? And in cases where it's like your current PI or things like that, maybe you can include a little bit about kind of skills that they can highlight, or like you have done your research about the kind of programs and the kind of people that they admit and how you want to talk about your skills a little bit. It's also this kind of reach out mail is really important if it's been a while since you spoke to this letter writer. So for example, in my case, I also requested some professors from my master's program to apply, and it had already been 4 years since I had graduated. And so at that time, you want to kind of reach out, giving them, like kind of like a reminder of who you are. Maybe like if it's a professor, what kind of grades you got. If there was any specific, maybe there was some feedback that they gave you or something which they thought you did very well in a presentation or something like that, you should mention those things. And the reason I say that is because don't feel like you're feeling awkward about like, oh, I did this and this was this and this was that, because they need to write you an extensive letter. It's not like a one paragraph letter. Grad school LORs are long, and you need to give them the material to be like able to write you a strong letter. So if they don't have much to talk about you, but they just want to be nice and give you a letter, it's going to be a really generic short letter, just like, yes, like Prachi was a good student. She attended class very well, and she participated and was a good communicator, and she got a fairly good grade. That's it. However, if you reach out to them and you tell them, if you remember, this was the presentation that I did. This was one optional coding assignment that you gave. I completed that as well, and then this was the final grade I got in the final exam or whatever, something like that, which gives them a couple of more sentences to talk about. That's very important. The other thing is reaching out to them a few months in advance is very important, because you kind of understand if this person is going to write you a letter or not. So if it's been 1 or 2 weeks, you can send them a follow-up email and be like, hi, just wanted to reach out and confirm, like if you would be able to write me a letter. And if they still don't respond, it's quite possible that maybe they're not comfortable writing you a letter, and that's fine, and you still have time to approach somebody else. So which happens, and it can happen for multiple reasons. But at that point, you just need to focus on, okay, who's the next person that I can go to? What that also means that it gives you some time to think about what constraints they may have. So for example, one of my professors, for example, was going on maternity leave. And so she told me, okay, as soon as portals open, like in October or November, you need to put in my email address immediately and let me know like what is the order of stuff that needs to happen, so that I can quickly send them out before like I am in the hospital and stuff like that. Like it needs to be done, and you need to ensure that I do it. And so for me, it was like, okay, like November, these need to go out, these need to go out, these need to go out. Okay, these like 2 or 3 deadlines are in January. I can, now trouble her on like Jan 14th. It's okay. But those are some things which you get to know only when you're doing it. So I also heard that there's sometimes some letter writers, PIs or professors who will tell you, oh, you're applying to, like 20 programs, I can write you 10 letters. And that's it. And so it gives you an option to be like, okay, I need to get now someone to write these letters for me in addition. And you want to think about, okay, if this person only writes me 10 letters, which 10 letters does it really matter? So it could be, for example, like your PI maybe did their PhD at a program that you're targeting, or did their master's at the school that you're like targeting your PhD in. So having the letter for those schools is more important perhaps than any other program or something like that. So you can work with these constraints if you have them a little bit in advance, as opposed to, when you're at the end, when you're just like, go, 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 I need to get my letters out. I would also say follow up with your referees. It's really important. And sometimes it feels really weird where you're like, hello, just to, check in. I have a deadline in 4 days and they haven't responded, or they haven't like done it, like acted upon it yet. And it feels awkward, and it feels, you're being kind of annoying by asking again and again. But what happens often is that whether it's PIs or it's professors, they are often writing dozens and dozens of letters, and they can't keep track of, each person's multiple deadlines. So reminders are good. It gets them to submit it in time. They are also trying to prioritize to ensure they're not missing people's deadlines. So it's okay. This used to happen with me often. Like I had a cluster of deadlines around like December 1st, and then like 2-3 deadlines on December 15th. And I realized that one of my professors, did all of that chunk together and then just didn't do that. And then she came to that later because she also had other students' letters to get out. So it's not on them to do it, just going over it. It is on you, and the portals have like the option to send like a reminder, and so that it kind of bumps up on their email and things like that. So do all of those things, even at the risk of, feeling pushy or whatever. They are campaigning for you, but you kind of need to campaign for yourself them as well. Just being like, hi, I'm so sorry, but can you please put this in right now? So yeah, I think that was sort of all from my end. Is there anything that either of you would like to add it?
One other quick clarification, I think particularly for PhD programs, when you say you need 2 to 3 recommendations, these are generally academic recommendations. So I think this is a question that people get a lot, like, so in my work, I've been working very closely with a government official. Does their letter count? And I feel like that's a little bit tricky, but generally PhD programs, you need to submit letters from practicing researchers. So even if they're not professors at universities, they need to kind of have research be a large chunk of the work that they do. And so when you think of who your letter writers should be, I think it helps to kind of identify people who are, academics in some way or the other. Another quick point is it helps to cover ground. So for example, if you have one letter writer from your master's program, one letter writer from, where you've been working for a year, and then another letter writer from your second job, for example, that would cover a host of skills. So when you think of letter writers, also try and think of people who can attest to varied skills. So if one person is going to talk about your qualities as a student, another person is going to talk about your abilities as a researcher, a third person is going to talk about, your project management abilities or your ability to navigate challenges in the field, or, something like that. But basically try and identify the people who can attest to different skills in this process, if possible.
Okay. I think nothing else can yeah, transcripts and coursework.
Great. I think with respect to transcripts and coursework, besides, I think beyond everything else, this came up in our discussion. I think Anahita also mentioned, and I had to go through this as well. Before you start, or probably somewhere early on, make a list of all the courses you've taken, all the textbooks you've used, because I do not remember off the top of my head what textbooks I used in my bachelor's, but there I did take like say quant courses or in my master's. So I think to start off with that, because some European programs also ask for this as to what courses did you take, what topics did you cover, in fact, what textbooks did you use, and this for them is a signal of your skill and what kind of experience you have. So that's something you should start off with. The second thing is format. So what kind of transcripts they need, what grade points do they measure in, what is their scale, what organizations are verifying or recognizing this, what is accepted, what is not. So start early on with that, because these are things that you don't have control on. Somebody else is processing it for you. So you might as well put that in and let that happen as you do other things in your process. So I think that is something very, very important. Another thing that's specific to the European programs, I probably it's in the US as well. Some of them actually ask the distribution of your score in your year for a particular, say, quant course and econometrics course. And that's happened to me a bit. So I think that is also something you could mail and ask for. Sometimes during my master's, they did mail us, even when I was doing my master's. So that's something you probably have access to, or sometimes don't. So if you don't, make sure you ask. Also, what ranking, what percentile, and all of those are questions that they definitely want to match your grade with. So I think these are all very administrative things, and you might as well get that done in the start. And if they need it, you can always supplement it. With respect to math coursework, especially with economics PhDs, they do want to see quantitative skills. So it's important to have and cite some of your quantitative courses. And as Prachi mentioned at the beginning, if you're unsure as to you meet the eligibility criteria, if there is no, say, money cost involved, financial cost involved, maybe it's worth applying to. Let's say you don't find anybody in the program and you're not able to understand if it's a hard screening or something that they factor in. But if there is a financial cost involved, then there are decisions to make. I think that's something, but do not, I think, discount yourself and do not turn away every eligibility criteria and not apply to all the programs just because you're 0.1 different from what they state. I think give a little bit of gray area there and choose accordingly. I think and most often it's a bunch of things that they're factoring in, not just one coursework in your bachelor's. The WSA process, I did not do. It's just a process of recognizing your scores in a standard format, especially when you've done your degrees in a country that is not probably where your PhD is. But I think Anahita or Prachi, both of you, either of you had to go through it. Maybe it's worth walking them through what the process was like.
Yeah, maybe I can very quickly, also just in the interest of time. One, it's important to find out whether or not the course that you're applying to requires a WES evaluation. Like Vasanthi mentioned, WES and other organizations are basically, they take your transcripts, they ask you to send them your original transcripts, and then they evaluate your score and give you a recalibrated score on a scale that is more easily understood by some of the universities that you're applying to. This is an expensive and a long process. So the suggestion is to start procuring this early. It involves getting your original documents, sending them to the WES office, and then having them mail you one version of your reevaluation, as well as mail universities your reevaluation. So start as early as possible. At the closer you reach deadlines, WES gets overburdened as well, and their processing times, in fact, slow down, I think, as you approach the application cycle. So try and have this done as early as possible. There are also others like Scholaro, I think there's a couple, and sometimes in the application portal, the university will state their preferred one. Some of these are free, some of these are paid. You just have to basically follow that particular university's instructions about how to go about it. Some universities explicitly say do not upload any course reevaluations, so over there make sure you don't upload any. But when it's asked for, make sure that you have it handy to upload if you're applying to a program that requires it. Anything to add, Prachi?
No, again, I think I would just say that if you are able to spend the money on it, it can be beneficial, because even though mine was a 4.0 GPA, like Anahita mentioned earlier, a lot of times in India, our grades are not as inflated as they are in the US. So doing that WES evaluation, my GPA went up by 0.35, which is a big number on a 4 scale. So it may be worth it if you are concerned that you are missing scores, like, you're not meeting that 3.3 or 3.5 cutoff that you really want to hit. It may be worth having this kind of evaluation. Also, if you've done your coursework, and like in the UK, my grades were in the form of like distinction, merit, pass, and my final grade ended up being a low merit, which sounds awful, but when you do it, you submit it to WES, it comes out to like just below a 3.5, which is a lot more decent. And again, these are just those kind of things which, if there is also like a hard screening, often these kind of things can just push you over for those kind of hard screenings as well. So it may be worth it, may not be worth it. If you already have like a 3.8 GPA, it may not matter. If you're someone who's like at a 3.3 and just wants to, boost it a little bit, it can sometimes help. So that's just one thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, so on the GRE, we will share the slide deck later. And so I think the blog that's linked here is very, very useful. I found it very useful. It's called How to Score a 330 on the GRE. I think the general wisdom is that PhD programs typically require above like 165 out of 117 quant. That's the kind of general wisdom. In verbal, it's a bit subjective, but I think what you're essentially aiming is somewhere above 165 in math and 160 plus in verbal. Of course, I think there's also kind of a growing kind of sense that GRE is becoming less and less important. But again, these are things that are largely out of your control. So if you're taking the GRE, you're applying to programs that need the GRE, I'm just going to very quickly talk about what helped me give it my best shot. I think step one is to take a diagnostic test. This helps kind of identify where you currently stand. I took a diagnostic test as early as April or March when I wanted to apply in December. Particularly if you've been out of school for a while, like I was like 2 years at JPAL, which is when I was applying to PhD. So you know a lot of these concepts, it's just that you've not kind of worked on them in a very long time. So take a diagnostic, it tells you where you currently stand, and then you move on to identifying your studying style. When you prepare a studying plan, it depends entirely on you and what works for you to study. Some people like 6 months of, 1 hour a day or like half an hour a day for 6 months type prep. Other people like, 1 month of like 4 hours a day sprint type prep. It depends on what works best for you. But essentially, you want to try and revise material, and you want to take your score from what your diagnostic test tells you up to the target. Right? Books that are useful for content prep, there's Manhattan, there's Kaplan, there's the ETS prep material, which is by the people who conduct the GRE. There's Magoosh vocabulary cards to learn your English words. I think these resources are available on the internet. I think there are people who've been very generous as to share ungated copies of at least the ebooks and stuff like that you can start with. I basically solved Manhattan back-to-back sums, just, do time drills and just keep solving till you are comfortable with the concept. Last quick point I'll talk about for the GRE is that practice tests are crucial. Even if you know a concept, the GRE is a long exam. I forget exactly how long it is right now, but it's like a good 4 to 5 hours sitting in one place, one section after the other. And so it's more about building stamina rather than just building skill. And so you really have to put yourself through that 4 to 5 hour grind a couple of times before you appear for the test, because it also helps take some of the stress off. So Manhattan and Magoosh have a lot of these practice tests. ETS gives you 2 practice tests with your registration. And so definitely take those. They're timed and they help you get also familiar with the interface. And so you're not confused about which buttons to click and so on the day. For Manhattan and Magoosh, these are expensive to afford on your own. But I think in groups, if you and your friends can kind of get together and get a subscription, or if you know somebody who did it last year, who still has a valid account that you can share, maybe that's one way to get your hand on a couple of diagnostic tests, a couple of practice tests through Manhattan and Magoosh. But yeah, and I think just around to complete, I think 3 to 4 tests before the test day is, I think, very, very useful. The tests also help you get a sense for where you stand in terms of achieving your target score. How to plan your attempts, depending on whether you think you're only going to take 1 attempt or whether you're going to take multiple attempts. I took my first attempt as early as July when I was applying in December, and then I had to take a couple more attempts leading up, but depends. I think I would suggest not leaving it to the last minute, because that just adds stress. So I would say try and get your first attempt in before October, because the last few months also get very, very busy with SOPs and other things that we're just about to talk about. I think we can move on.
Just one quick point. Yeah. I would highly recommend also looking at this guy, Greg Matt, like it's spelled GREGMAT, and he has free resources, and he basically like just solves through the ETS material. And like Anahita said, it's not so much about skill. It's definitely about stamina. And by watching Greg Matt's videos, you'll also realize there's a lot about like just kind of figuring out what are the usual tricks ETS throws your way. You very quickly realize patterns. So for example, I only did ETS material. I got a couple of their PDFs online, and the only thing I spent money on was on their tests, which they have. So like Anahita mentioned, there's 2 free ones as well as 3 additional ones which you can pay for. And that was all the material I did, because as you start doing it, you very quickly realize what are the same kind of trick questions they throw in verbal, what are the same kind of patterns which come up in quant again and again. So yeah, that's just something to work to, that's worth looking at, something like videos and things like that, if you are like a visual learner, for example. So that definitely helped me.
Okay, also I just want to ask, what is a hard stop, because we're at 7:15. So I think another 15-ish minutes, 15-20 minutes, and we should try and wrap.
Okay. Yeah, I think I would encourage if we can wind it up within 15, but if there is a need to spill another 5 or 10 over and above the 15, it's fine.
Okay, so we'll try and keep our bits contained to 15, and then we can spend 5 minutes on questions.
Perhaps, yeah, the questions can be towards an additional 10 minutes. Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay.
I think somebody has a question on GRE. Aparna says, I'm pursuing master's.
Oh yes, I saw. I think ideally when I should give my GRE, I think I tried to cover, I would say first attempt before October to avoid stress. But again, it depends on you and how many attempts you're budgeting.
Okay. I think I've taken IELTS, so I will talk about IELTS, and I took it for my master's. It's like, I think GRE, it is also a question of format. You're mostly comfortable with the content. I spent about a week to 10 days. You could do probably slightly more if you want more, if testing helps you, etc. The only place they have a textbook that comes with it, so you just practice using the book. The only thing that needs slightly more practice is the listening skills as well, because you just want to be comfortable with the audio, the accent, and everything else. So I think I would spend slightly more time on that. So just practicing through the book and doing the listening skills and making sure you understand what they're saying and how do you correspond the audio to your text and the questions. I think those are the things that I would focus on. It is not a particularly difficult test. It's just a matter of practice and being familiar with what they're looking for and the format. And I think it's fairly easy. TOEFL, maybe Prachi and Anahita, I haven't taken TOEFL, so
yeah, I think I'm going to let Prachi spend like 2 minutes on trying and securing an exemption. I agree with everything Vasanthi said. The English language requirements are sometimes just like a box you have to tick. And so using the material that they provide to practice and familiarize yourself with the format is, I think, the approach that I took for TOEFL as well.
Yeah. So I was quite aggressive with mine, like I will get an exemption thing, because what I'd also given the IELTS for the UK. Yes, the IELTS. And the problem what happens is that apparently your scores expire in 2 years and you just kind of forget all the English you knew. And so at the time of application, there are many schools which, if you have studied in a place like the UK, there's some places also have India on their list. So if you've done it at an Indian university, whose mode of instruction is primarily English, you are exempt and things like that. So it's worth checking that before you go and give your exam. So in my case, it seemed to be that I was exempt from a lot of places in any event between India and having studied at in the UK. Even with the UK, there are often these rules, like even if you've studied in like a UK, Australia, Singapore, those kind of countries, but if it was over 3 years ago or 4 years ago, it doesn't count towards an exemption. And so in these cases, I directly wrote to the university and I mentioned that I have done all my schooling in India in English, including my undergraduate degree. I then did my master's in the UK. And then after coming back, I have continued work in a international in an international setting where you are communicating in English, etc., and secured an exemption. So there are universities, for example, I remember, I'm forgetting which all these were, but like Tufts, for example, I wasn't automatically exempt, but they did give me an exemption after I wrote to them. There are some universities which don't budge, and they're a bit like, this is not like a department level requirement. It is at the like a graduate school level. We can't do anything. In my case, it so happened that it was just one program like that, and it was a program that I anyway wasn't a great fit for, so I just let it go and I didn't give the exam. But that can be something that you think about. It's worth a shot, because like if it so happens that most of your programs don't need it, or you are able to get an exemption, it's just one less thing to do, one less thing to spend money on.
Yeah, and I think before we move on to SOP, one quick thing that, just in case this isn't something we've discussed before, for GRE and TOEFL, you have to send your scores to these schools, which means ETS, or like the testing agency, has to send these scores to the school. And so what that means is, for the GRE, I think 3 schools are for free. So when you go into the test, at the end of the test, they will ask you, you can send these scores to 3 schools for free. So over there, it's helpful to know what are 3 programs you're certain you're going to apply to, because then otherwise, if you submit it to schools you don't end up applying to, you're wasting those free attempts. So at least try and have a sense for what these schools are. Every school has a TOEFL, has a code, which is very easily available on their websites. Add this to your tracker at the beginning, so that when you need to kind of find the university, you have to find it through this code. So these 3 schools come for free with the GRE, but then after that, for every additional school, you have to pay some dollar amount and send your score to the school. And it typically takes ETS 1 week to 10 days to send your score. So make sure you've sent your scores to these. So make sure you've gone on ETS and kind of submitted all the schools you want to send your scores to at least 10 days before the deadline.
This is also a good reason to not have your GRE or TOEFL very close to deadlines.
Exactly.
Because the closer you are to deadlines, the 7 days becomes 10 working days.
Yeah. And like once you take the test, it takes them about 10 days to send you your official scores, and then another 10 days to start sending those to schools. So most schools say on their website, don't schedule the attempt after November. But yeah, we should keep going. We're running out of time.
Okay. So we're going to go over the SOP really quickly, and the focus here, I think, because there was already a session where I think things like the SOP were covered. What we're going to focus on here is just specifically how an SOP will differ at a PhD level from a master's level. There needs to be a bit of a shift when you start working on it. And in many ways, I think your master's SOP often focuses on what you want to learn at the department, whereas at your PhD SOP, you need to switch gears and think about how well you kind of integrate into the department in terms of what skills you already bring in, what methods you've already worked with, what thematic interests you have, what kind of past experiences you have, things like that. This is also where, like we spoke about earlier, you're fit with the department where it comes to their ongoing projects, the professors who work there, maybe what kind of research they have going on. Are there professors who are maybe actively working with international organizations or policymakers or things like that? And if those are experiences that you have, it's a good time to highlight it. And the reason for that is the department could be a great fit for you, and you have thought about how you integrate in very well, but your SOP is your chance to kind of show that to them. And the way to think about it is like, you don't want the person reading your SOP having to make that connect. Like, you are making the connect for them. You're telling them that so and so has these projects going on. I would be a great asset for XYZ reason, or whatever it is. That's where you kind of are making that connect for them. It's also a good place to talk about. You should include something about your future goals. It doesn't need to be set in stone. No one is going to come at the end of the PhD program and say, oh, you are transitioning to industry, but you had mentioned you want to be an economics professor. No one's going to do that. It's fine. It's just to get a sense of whether you understand what this PhD means for you in your career. So for example, if at that point, this is just like one example off the top of my head, but like if you want to work in like economic consulting, for example, and you're like, oh, and that's why I want to do my PhD, their immediate thinking is going to be, but why? Like, how does this PhD help? Aren't there people straight out of masters who do these kind of jobs? Why do you specifically want to spend this chunk of time doing this program, right? So talking about your career and how the PhD kind of fits in there in just a couple of sentences is important, because it shows sort of like that you have thought about this seriously. It may be something which comes up in your interview, may not come up in your interview, like just things like that. These are kind of important points to just touch upon, at least when you're going through it. But I would say your paragraph or so talking about fit with the department is very important. And your paragraphs talking about your abilities and achievements are very important. And at this point, like when the three of us were discussing this before the session as well, this is like, like Anahita mentioned, she's like, saying things like, oh, I came at the top of my cohort. Like, they often don't come naturally to us, but you do have to, say that in your SOP in so many words. You can't say I was a fairly good student. No, if you stood, second in your class of 100 students, mention that. Like I put here in parentheses, this is not the place to be humble. At this point, you are campaigning for yourself, and it's okay for it to be like a aggressive campaign. You should be talking up your skills and your achievements, because think of it as like everyone else applying will be doing the same. And at that point, you also want to have someone else having reviewed these SOPs. Just because I think the more you look at it, especially if you spend, a couple of months on it, you very quickly start glazing over, like missing commas, repeated words, things like that. Having someone else read it for those things is helpful. But more importantly, if you can have someone who is, either a PhD student or in some form in academic research or in any capacity, who understands that kind of writing, they are able to tell you, okay, this is flowing well, but I don't quite understand what is the point of this paragraph. Like, what is this supposed to tell me about you as a candidate, or things like that. It is helpful to have someone look at that or be like, okay, this is not really flowing in a very cohesive manner. Can we think about restructuring it a little bit? It is helpful to have someone give you feedback like that, because those are the things, as you have written them, they make like complete sense to you, but it may not make sense to someone who doesn't know you at all. So it's helpful to have someone read it. And yeah, is there any other points that you would like to bring in at this point?
I think just one thing that my professor told me, the one that I'm working currently with, he also mentioned how it's important to only highlight relevant abilities. So think about things that is most important to your PhD and program. He cited winning a quiz in probably economics. They don't really care. So things that are really, really relevant to the particular program, tailor it as much as possible so that they read what they want. The other thing I think throughout we've all been mentioning is review by a mentor, review by somebody, a PI. And I also understand that not all of us in this room today have a PI or a mentor, and probably we don't have good relationship with people who are working and whatever. I think it's good to reach out to potential people who have the networks. Women in Economics definitely is a good platform. On the WhatsApp, there are plenty of, I think, opportunities and people who are probably will be willing to. The world is kind, and you will find somebody, but maybe it's slightly more effort. But I think that's also something, but it's still very, very important to get it reviewed. Just maybe a little bit more effort to find a person to do that for you. Yeah. Those are the only two things I wanted to add.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be talking about the next thing just after this, but this is also where the statement of purpose is different from your personal statement. Like Vasanthi mentioned, your statement of purpose is very specific to your program. How do certain things in your experiences or education relate to that program? As opposed to just like, oh, when I first went to so-and-so place, I knew I wanted to work in this field forever. That's great. That's okay for like a one sentence, but you can't have, unlike a master's history, you can't have this paragraph about how you came to love this particular theme. At your SOP, your space is very constrained and you don't want to talk about that. Okay, in that case, I'm going to move to the personal statement because that's where some of this stuff comes in. This is where you can kind of talk about the more personal things as well. So, for example, this may not be relevant to everyone here, but for example, the education programs that I was applying for all required a personal statement. And that was kind of the place where I could talk about maybe the fact that I had done volunteer work, which, an economics and education PhD SOP would not be the place to talk about. But talking about how those experiences kind of teach you ground realities would be important in a personal statement, for example. And that's where you kind of think about, I had read this quote somewhere, which is like your personal statement is a little, retrospective, where you're thinking about, okay, how do these experiences make me who I am today, versus your SOP is a little bit about who I'm going to be in the program and what this program is going to make 5-6 years later. It's not the best description, but that's kind of to think about the two things, like the way that they change. Your personal statement also often is kind of like your diversity statement, where if you are an underrepresented group, whether that's gender or sexuality or disability or anything like that, that can be something which is important to mention here. It could be also things like experiences which may not be relevant academically or may not be relevant thematically, but they are an important part maybe of explaining like bad grades or something like that. And if you want to mention it, that could be the place. But one thing to keep in mind is that not all universities have this option. So if, for example, there is something which you think is really important for applicants to, for your adcoms to know about you, and let's say you did like really poorly maybe in your undergraduate and then you have good grades later, maybe it's worth making that sentence in your actual SOP, because a lot of schools don't have a personal statement. Some are optional, but I think a lot of the universities that I applied to didn't necessarily have it. So that's just something to keep in mind. Like if you think there's something really important, it may be worth keeping in your SOP. Your personal statement is often like an additional, not required document. That's just one way to think about it.
Okay, I'm going to quickly go over this because we don't have a lot of time. 3 things to remember. Your writing sample is, they're just going to assess your writing skills and how articulate you are, how you're able to present an idea. The only thing that you need to remember is make sure they have the opportunity to do that as much as possible. If it's an econ PhD or something more quantitative, make sure you don't give them a blog that you published for an audience that wasn't catered or wasn't for any quant catered audience. So I think give them a little bit of opportunity to see both your quant presentation skills as well as your writing skills so that it is as concise and they're able to do that. These are most often not tailored to programs. Most programs don't ask you, give me a writing sample in a particular topic. So make sure it's set aside some like a pre-prep work of 2 to 3 writing samples varying lengths. I think that's something you should do. And the third thing about length is also that on an average, most programs will have I think fairly similar lengths for their writing sample. So make sure you're not saving or setting aside long papers for this submission. So set aside something that's fairly similar to the requirements of most programs, and I think you should be good. Not all programs ask for this again. I think those are the only I think most important things that I think you should remember about a writing sample.
Yeah, I think one thing we can probably address here is a couple of questions in the chat box, and I think we'd also received them earlier, is like how important it is to have publications before you apply. And I think there, my take is that it's not necessary to have published papers before you apply to a PhD program. If you do, that's a strong signal. If you are, if there are things you're working on with other people, collaborators that are in a working paper stage, I think the place to mention that would be your CV. So, in your CV, have a research section and mention all the papers that are at working paper stage, or like projects that are ongoing, where you in brackets mention the stage, like, oh, data collection ongoing or something like that, if you have it. I do not think these are make or break components of your application. I don't think people expect you to go into a PhD with a series of publications. So don't worry if you do not have publications before you apply for a PhD. And one quick point about writing sample, I think it's generally expected that it's sole authored, like it's single authored, because if you've written it with somebody else, it's very hard for them to tell what part you've written and what part the other person has written. So make sure whatever writing sample you're setting aside, it's something you have produced mostly independently, and kind of it's your own work. Okay, I think we can move on. I will be very quick with interviews because typically these come at a stage later than the application, and we'll cover these a little bit perhaps in other sessions. In my experience, and I'll let Vasanthi add for Europe, but in my experience for US programs, interviews tend to be more conversational rather than kind of the interviewer will ask you a question and you will be expected to give an answer type format. It's more to get to know you a bit better, get to know your application a bit better, and primarily to assess your fit for the program, and secondly to assess your research interests and the relevant skills and experience that you have. So often it will be faculty members talking to you about what the program is and what you imagine yourself doing if you were a part of the program, what research interests you'd expect to pursue, what methods you're interested in, and they're very upfront about the kind of support the department can or cannot provide to you given your research interests. One quick thing about interviews, particularly for US and other programs that are scheduled, it's helpful to go in with questions. This is a platform where you will be able to ask a lot of questions about that specific program that you may not have answers to, and it will really help you in your decision-making process later. So definitely go in and ask, straight up questions about the program atmosphere, about the kind of support they provide graduate students for research, if you expect to be doing field work, how students raise money for field work, and so on and so forth. So definitely go in with questions. It's also a strong signal of your interest in the program, and faculty are usually very forthcoming and kind in their answers. So definitely, if you have interviews lined up, go in with questions that you've prepared beforehand.
Yeah, I think for Europe is very similar as well. It's very conversational. Most often, I also think it's a lot to do with the professor talking about the program or the professors talking about the department, etc. So I think it's not a one-way thing. I think that's the only thing you should always remember. These interviews are always two-way. The second thing that I did, and I think was fairly helpful, was I also did a mock interview with one of my PIs, because European interviews, sometimes they also question you on your research proposals. You do submit one, we'll talk about it. So to have them ask you the hard questions, and it's good to be prepared and you were comfortable when you're talking to a bunch of people. I think those are the only two things, and they're fairly similar to what Anahita mentioned in Europe as well.
We are on our second last slide. So,
all right. About research proposal, you do not have to, I think, be 100% through with this, during your, so after your submission, it's not that by the end of 3 years or during those 3-4 years in Europe, you have to follow word to word of everything that you've mentioned. This is a research proposal is a beginning, and it can vary as much through the course. And most often people don't end up with what they submitted. It's extremely different, at least in Europe, I can say that, because through time you understand different implications and implementation issues and all of that. What they do expect is your ability to ideate, to bring something comprehensive to the table in terms of methodology, the questions, the mechanisms, and that's the goal. So you don't have to worry about, you do have to think about a feasible project, nothing absolutely out of the world, but at the same time, you don't have to worry about sticking to every word of your research proposal and what if I change my mind. It should never be your worry. So I think, but this is a major chunk. It will take a lot of time. It's going to be reviewed. Also, because it's a entire new question that you're trying to ask and develop, I think it's worth spending, especially if you're applying to European programs, it's worth spending a considerable amount of time on this. And most often, this is also something that's not tailored, because if you know you're going to be working in economics or probably, let's say, health economics or gender economics, this doesn't have to be different for every school you're applying to. So it can be just one research proposal that covers the umbrella that you're applying to, but just spend a lot of time in the beginning to set this, and then I think you don't have to customize it to every program that you're doing. But yeah, this is just a beginning, and that's the only thing you should remember, and don't have to worry too much about what you do at the end.
Great. I think I will this is the last slide, and I won't spend too much time on it. Once we send you the slide deck, you can take a look at a sample tracker that I've linked. It's basically what I used. And I think, so there's a couple of quick tabs. It starts with exhaustive list of economics and public policy programs that then you can shortlist. Next, there's a tab for a list of all the programs you've decided to apply to, with like columns for like TOEFL code, GRE code, your username, your password, things that you create for that program, as well as specifications about like SOP length and any other specific requirements for that program. There's a tab where you should list out faculty for each of the program that interest you, so that it helps you write your SOP. And then there are a couple of other general trackers that you can familiarize yourself with. One quick tip on, navigating application season, and I'll take this opportunity to answer a question that was in the chat box about how to do it if you're working side by side, which I was, is one, I think it really helps to be very methodical and organized and really track applications carefully. There are many deadlines, there are things to miss. So for example, what I'd done for the 25 programs that I applied to is I'd put them in batches. So batch 1 was deadlines from 1st to 5th December, and my goal was to get it submitted before 30th November. The next batch was deadlines from up to 15th December, and my goal was to submit it by 10th December. And then there were Jan deadlines, which was my batch 3. And so if you divide programs into batches and roughly, okay, like in this span, I have to submit X number of applications, after a point, it just becomes uploading a bunch of documents, but it's useful to have some kind of tracking in your head about how to do this. Last thing, it helps to create program specific subfolders. So for every program that you're applying to, create a folder on Drive or Dropbox and upload everything you need to upload to that program in that subfolder, so that when you're actually sitting down to do the uploading, it's just a question of dragging and dropping files. That's the only kind of advice I would have for actually navigating application season. For how to do it with work, I think what helped me, and again, this may differ from person to person, is to just have a conversation with your peers and your manager and often your PIs at work. And tell them that, this is going to be a grueling time, November to January. Everybody expects it. November and December is a grueling season. So explain to them that, you will want to hard stop work at say 6 p.m. so that you can spend 2 hours every day at the end of the day working on your applications, or you may want to take a couple of days off to submit your applications. I think most workplaces hopefully are encouraging and, enough to let you do that. But the best way is to just have a forthcoming conversation with your peers and your managers and people you're working with, to let them know why your availability might be a little limited during the season, or why you may need some extra time off. But that's it. And I think I don't have anything to add. In case we don't have time for questions, my email ID is in the chat box. So feel free to write to me about econ PhDs, which is what I'm best equipped to answer. Over to whoever wants to go next. And sorry for the session running so long.
I have nothing to add as well. My email ID is up on the chat as well. So if there are questions about EU PhDs, I'm more than happy to answer, and also put in touch with people who helped me during my applications. I do think I have the privilege of some of them who are definitely who can help. So I'm happy to do that as well.
Yep, likewise. My email ID is there. If anyone wants to reach out for public policy related questions, feel free. And I don't know if I'm the best person for like education PhDs, because I didn't get an admit, but I did get lots of information about it and how I was not the perfect candidate. So perhaps I can help if that's of interest to anyone.
I think all the questions in the chat box have been answered along with the presentation. So in case there are no further questions, I think we're okay to close the session. Prachi, Anahita, and Vasanthi, thank you so much for spending so much time to really get into the nuances of this application process. And while it might seem very, very intimidating, because if there is somebody who can really break it down to us, and it just really helps, take this process head on. So a big thank you to all three of you for spending the time to really go into the details of each and every process. And I'm sure there's so much that everybody took away from this presentation as well as this session. So yeah, I think if there are no further questions, we're okay to close the session. Everybody, it's just a reminder, this month for us is a graduate application support month. So we will be continuing with additional sessions. And so I would request everybody to keep an eye out on our pages and our website, as well as the WhatsApp groups on the sessions we're hosting, and tune in accordingly. And so, yeah, I think we're okay to wrap up now. Thank you so much, all three of you, and thank you so much for everybody for tuning in.